They told me to tear out the rose bed, or the neighborhood would make my life impossible. And 20 minutes later, there were handcuffs on my wrists in my own front yard. I stood there with dirt under my nails and the smell of crushed petals in my throat, thinking this can't be real until it was. My name's Ethan Cole, and that little patch of roses behind my gate was the last thing my grandmother left me planted the year my dad was born. It wasn't a decoration, it was a memory, and I wasn't about to let some self-appointed enforcer dig it up for a ledger entry. Cedar Ridge used to be the kind of place where people borrowed sugar and left their doors unlocked. That was before Margot Hale moved in with her clipboards and self-important smile. She introduced herself like she'd always belonged to the town council navy blazer, hair tight as a noose, voice sweet enough to make you hand over a deed. "Mr. Cole, your roses violate Section 12.4, she said, tapping a pre-printed form with the kind of confidence that comes from practice. "Please bring them into compliance." I told her they were planted in 1982, long before any of her rules, and she smiled like someone who'd already written the ending to a story I didn't know I was starring in. That first day, the car at the corner looked like coincidence. The car that came back 3 days later with a radio that chirped on command wasn't. Officer Hastings arrived the next morning under the pretext of a welfare check, concerned neighbors he called it, and Margot's voice chimed through his speaker like a director running a scene. When a police presence switches from patrol to performance, you learn fast that authority can be performed as easily as it can be wielded. My neighbor Becky looked at me from across the street, eyes quick and guilty. Most of them were afraid that's how the script works. They hit us where it hurts, fines, notices, social pressure that makes friends step back on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. My freelance work got called into question. Maya, my wife, got whispers at school. Clients asked questions they didn't have the right to ask. The roses, the thing that grounded me, became a wedge between us and the rest of the street. I remember sitting on the wooden bench my grandmother carved my hands in the soil and thinking, this is small enough to fight and big enough to ruin everything. So we started documenting. I took photos, my grandmother's old planting receipts, letters from the Historical Society, every tiny paper that could prove a roots before rules story. An old man across the hedges, Harold Finch, slid a folder through the fence one night like contraband. He'd watched this pattern before, a notice, then a curiously timed safety inspection, then a frantic sale at below market, then the same house listed for profit by people who had been way too eager to buy. He'd written down names, dates, transaction amounts, patterns that smelled of intention, not accident. When you line up enough coincidences, and they all point to the same address, it stops being coincidence and starts being a plan. That's when an anonymous message arrived. "Don't remove the roses. Evidence is being gathered." It sounded like a taunt until a stranger left an envelope on my car with bank statements and transaction trails that traced assessment payments to a shell company registered in a neighboring county. The money flowed like a river through places that didn't exist. Suddenly, the little battles over hedges looked like a laundering operation dressed in suburban beige. We tried the obvious city inspection, and at first a real inspector agreed with us, no hazard, no violation. Then she was reassigned, transferred, gone, as if the system itself had been nudged. That's when we realized this wasn't just one bad apple. It was a network with reach. Margot had friends in uniform, people who called the meetings and set the agendas, and a legal cover that looked convincing until you pulled at the seams. We made a plan because the other option was to sell our lives away. The plan was ugly and brave and relied on something Margot couldn't resist: pride. She loved the stage. We staged a surrender, called her, played the part of the weary homeowner ready to cooperate, asked to meet and discuss terms for a sale. Hidden cameras were set in the kitchen. Our attorney sat 2 rooms away on standby, and a man who introduced himself at the library as someone who knew The inside handed us a folder thick with receipts, text messages, and emails that showed coordination, payments, favors, quick responses from officers who showed up at exactly the right moment. When Margot walked into our house with a lawyer and a fake inspector trailing behind, she carried the air of someone who already counted the profit. The conversation started civil, appropriately staged, then she slipped. Pride is a dangerous thing when you feed it a victory. She'd bragged about runs she'd cleaned up, and she used language that implied direct involvement in enforcement actions that belonged to official agencies, not volunteer boards. A careless phrase here, a nod there, and suddenly, the tape pulled everything into focus. The real turning point was ordinary and cinematic. All at once, Margot's husband, a quiet man named Daniel, showed up pale as paper and exhausted. And then he started talking. He had documents, keyed deposits, emails, the kind of marriage room confessions you see in movies. He'd been the one who'd watched it happen, and finally decided it was worse than the secret he'd been keeping. With his testimony, the net closed fast. State inspectors showed up with warrants, bank accounts were frozen, and the HOA office, the neat little room with its volunteer plaque, was sealed the same day. They dissolved the association on the steps of the community center, and for the first time in months, we heard a kind of official breath that felt like relief. Investigators called it an elaborate scheme, fake bylaws forged in corporation documents, assessments collected into accounts that fed a circle of shell companies and contractors who billed for work never performed. 47 families were named as victims, numbers that felt impossible until you watched the ledgers and saw the math of it all. Restitution followed. The Roses got a historic designation, which felt like both a small mercy and a necessary symbol. But the end wasn't clean. Margot's arrest played on the news with the same dramatic arc she had always wanted for herself, clipped statements, garden shots cut to music, neighbors smiling for cameras. People called for harsher regulations, for laws to prevent this exact thing from happening again, and lawmakers wrote proposals that now carry our street's name as an example. Daniel disappeared for a while, and then reappeared helping investigators and speaking at forums about civic duty. Harold became a kind of unlikely advocate, hosting seminars on what to watch for in volunteer boards. Maya went back to work, her classroom quieter than before, but proud when parents asked her how to teach kids about courage, not because we wanted to be heroes, but because we had no other choice. The most honest part of this whole thing sits in the quiet. After the flashbulb's power is simple to fake and courage is quiet work. Our neighbors rebuild trust slowly because fear leaves its fingerprints. There are still arguments at meetings, old grudges that don't wash away with laws, and people who wonder if the price of vigilance is perpetual suspicion. I don't have a tidy moral to hand you. Only this, a community that chooses to protect its own stories, that documents, that asks hard questions, can turn a crooked ledger into a courtroom, and a row of roses into a reminder. So tell me, what would you do if your memories were on the line, and the very idea of community had been weaponized? Is the solution stronger oversight, harsher penalties, or something else entirely? Drop a comment below with what you think. Tell me where the line is between neighborhood standards and organized abuse. And if you've ever had to fight for something that felt like it belonged to your family, share your story. Let's talk about what justice looks like on a street where everyone thought they already knew the rules.